I've been asked to give a brief introduction of Clement of Alexandria. I'm going to make the case that he should be venerated as a saint.
I gave my presentation in Rome together with Dr. John Vervaeke.
And you said, John, Clement of Alexandria should be in the Philosophical Silk Road. He's the first person to really bring Christianity and Greek philosophy together.
Your Eminence, Your Grace, Father Carcius, and beloved fellow faculty, particularly the group calling themselves the Clementines, the adherents of devotees of Clement of Alexandria, dear students and staff, it's a pleasure to be here, and it's a great honor to be able to speak about a figure within the history of Orthodox theology who's so important but so misunderstood and rather underestimated. I hope to be able to convey extra reasons in addition to what we heard this morning from His Grace and Father Gregory for, if not necessarily regarding him as a saint, at least having a high esteem for him and putting him in proper perspective. So, in his epistle to the Romans, St. Paul writes that the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. This, he says, leaves unbelievers without excuse, because God has already, as it were, spoken to them through his creation. Aside from being, if I may so put it, St. Paul's charter for natural theology, this verse is of great importance to us as we explore Clement of Alexandria, his contribution to the articulation of Orthodox doctrine. The invisible things of God, his eternal power and divinity, are explained by St. Nicodemus, a Hagiorite, as follows. He first asks, what of God, i.e. what aspect of God can be known, and replies that one aspect of God is unknown or unknowable, that is, his essence or nature. But in another aspect, he is known or knowable, that is, in what is discerned, quote, around his essence or nature, unquote. That is, his goodness, wisdom, power, majesty, and so on. In a footnote, St. Nicodemus expounds further on this point. Older theologians and saints, he says, call God's natural properties his essential powers and uncreated energies. St. Dionysius the Areopagite calls them processions, proodi, ascribing them to the entire Holy Trinity. More recent theologians, he probably has in mind figures like Eugenius Vulgaris and St. Athanasius of Paros, call them attributes and perfections of God, a rather Western term, but that was the vogue in those days. If you read the Theological of Vulgaris, you'll see very little of the essence of energies, practically nothing of it, unfortunately, but that was the time he lived in, that was the influence he was subject to. Well, in his first epistle to St. Timothy, St. Paul speaks of God as him who alone hath immortality, dwelling in light unapproachable, whom no man hath seen nor can see. Without claiming that this constitutes a perfect specimen of apophatic theology, I think it is reasonable to see in it, at the very least, adumbration of later patristic thought on this subject, insofar as it characterizes the light in which God dwells, which is, of course, uncreated light, as unapproachable, and God himself as invisible, and by extension, unknowable. These three terms, unapproachability, invisibility, and unknowability, are all hallmarks of apophatic theology, though there are others, of course, of equal importance, such as ineffability and incomprehensibility. Incidentally, for those interested in following up the scriptural dimension and background of both these topics, I strongly recommend a groundbreaking article, The Divine Energies in the New Testament, by Professor David Bradshaw, familiar to some of you as the author of an equally groundbreaking book, Aristotle East and West. Well, let's now fast forward to the previous century. Sometime during the 1960s, a prominent Greek academic theologian by the name of Konstantinos Muratidis, a specialist in canon law, expressed grave reservations about what he and many of his colleagues in the theological faculties in Athens and Thessaloniki saw as dangerous novelties in the work of emigre Russian theologians like Vladimir Lossky. One of these alleged novelties was the strong emphasis placed by these theologians on the crucial role of apophatic theology, or apophatism, to put it in more ideological terms, in the articulation of Orthodox dogma. As the late Christos Yanaras records the professor's words, Moratides declared that, quote, apophatism, since itself it signifies a negation, is inadmissible for Orthodox theology, unquote. What probably led the good professor to make such a curious statement was an alternative name often given to apophatic theology, namely negative theology, or the via negativa, the negative way, so-called, a term much more current in Western Christianity. This anecdote is to be found in Yanaras's well-known article, Theology in Present-Day Greece, from 1972. In this same article, Yanaras observes, with reference to the 3-volume work Dogmatiki, the dogmatic theology of Professor Panayotis Trembelas, and its learned author makes no reference to the neptic and mystical fathers of the Orthodox East, that is, the fathers of the Philokalia, that he ignores the entire area of the Hesychast tradition, that there's no reference anywhere in any of these volumes to the distinction between the essence and energies of God, the specific difference that separates orthodoxy from every other theology, and that is of vital importance in safeguarding this theology from the dangers of scholasticism and rationalism. That's Yanaras's estimation. One might add that the entire tradition of apophatic theology, which is a very closely connected both with hesychasm and with the essence energies distinction, is likewise regrettably absent from Trembelas's work. I might add, though, to put things in a different perspective, that Trembelas was, by all accounts, a man of not immense erudition, but also deep piety and a faithful son of the church, as was Moratides, no doubt. But this is just a reflection of the times in which they lived, of the upbringing they had. In fact, they studied in Western European universities, especially in Germany, brought these ideas back with them to Greece, and unfortunately that infected their presentation of Orthodox dogma and other related subjects. Well, I'd like to underscore the preceding statement by Yanaras, because I'm convinced that we can't reiterate often enough the indispensability of the apophatic approach and of the distinction between the essence and energies of God to a correct exposition of Orthodox theology. To be sure, we've come a long way in the last 60 or 70 years in terms of what is available to the English-speaking faithful now. The Orthodox Faith, Worship and Life, a title of an Orthodox catechism by the Hieromonk Gregorius of the Holy Mountain, is an excellent presentation of Orthodox doctrine. Was published just 5 years ago. It has more references, or at least allusions, to both apathetic thought and the divine energies. Welcome contrast to a now standard and otherwise very fine compendium of Orthodox dogmatic theology, familiar to all of you, I think, by Protoprofessor Michael Pomazanski, also a man of profound erudition and deep piety and holiness. But in its first and second editions, he made almost no mention of apathetic thought or the divine energies. To their credit, the fathers of the St. Herman Brotherhood in Platina enhanced the third edition of this work with numerous passages from Lossky's The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church, a veritable classic in its own right, thereby affording readers a better understanding of patristic thought on these topics. Even so, one is left with the impression that these constitute little more than add-ons, which are not integral to the author's main argument. So anyone who begins to explore Orthodox teaching by way of Father Michael's book, despite the benefits he can derive from it, runs the risk of not setting off on quite the right foot. Well, that's the modern dimension of it. Now, I've prefaced my account of Clement, his thinking on apophatic theology and the essence energies distinction, with these remarks to situate his contribution to philosophical theology within the mainstream of patristic thought, and thereby, I hope, indicate to you his continuing relevance to the Church today. Now, if one were to ask any reasonably educated Orthodox Christian, what are the sources for a theological distinction, and allied with it, a mode of theological thinking which are commonly held to be fundamental to the teaching of the Church, i.e. the essence-energies distinction, he would undoubtedly respond by citing St. Gregory Palamas, and rightly so. However, if you recall the two passages in the Pauline epistles which I cited earlier, you'll appreciate that the roots of both the essence-energies distinction and the apophatic approach run much deeper than is commonly supposed. The distinction, in particular, is very far from being an invention by St. Gregory Palamas in the 14th century, or even of the Cappadocian Fathers in the 4th century. Not only is it to be encountered in Holy Scripture if you search it carefully with the right mentality, it's also expressed in one form or another, as we'll see, by some of the Church Fathers known as the Apologists. Before turning to the Apologists and Clement, I'd like to present for your consideration, for our collective orientation within this realm of theological discourse, 3 well-known passages from 4th century Fathers that attest to their knowledge and application of the essence-energies distinction, and one passage from St. Gregory of Nyssa, which exemplifies the apophatic approach to theology, a quintessentially patristic approach to theology. It will be helpful for us to keep in mind these more developed articulations of the essence-energies distinction as we study several key passages from Clement which demonstrate his awareness of this way of understanding the nature of God and of the value of apophatic language. A caveat is in order here. Whenever we read pre-Nicene theology, it's always advisable, on the one hand, to be forgiving to the authors when we see them expressing their thinking in less sophisticated or ambiguous terminology and phraseology, and on the other hand, to resist the temptation to assume that they're talking about a particular topic precisely the same terms or with exactly the same intentions as later fathers. A more general point will be the familiar maxim from St. Gregory the Theologian, we're concerned about things, not about words. We can differ about verbal expressions, but it's the realities, the divine realities, that we're interested in getting right. So we'll keep that in mind. Now, let's begin by looking at the 3 passages which feature the essence-energies distinction. So first, from St. Basil the Great, the energies are various, and the essence simple, but we say that we know our God from his energies, yet do not undertake to approach his essence. His energies come down to us, but his essence remains inaccessible. Letter 234, a classic statement of this distinction. Secondly, from St. Gregory of Nyssa, God is invisible by nature, but becomes visible in his energies. For he may be contemplated in certain things around him which are beheld. That's a rather awkward translation, but the Greek is a little difficult to get across. I'll explain more shortly what that means. Is homily 6 on the Beatitudes. It's a beautiful homily. You should all read it. All his homilies on the Beatitudes are wonderful, but that's especially important. Then, finally, from Athanasius the Great, as he is in all creation, he is in essence outside the universe, but in everything by his powers, ordering everything, extending his providence over everything. Before we come to the passage on apophatic theology, there are 2 points which require clarification. First, in a quotation from St. Gregory, the things around him is a way in which St. Gregory and his fellow Cappadocians refer to the divine energies using the Greek preposition peri with the accusative case to denote the energies or attributes as opposed to the essence, for which these fathers employ the Greek preposition kata with the accusative case. It's a technical point, but it's worth bearing in mind. Secondly, when St. Athanasius speaks about God's powers, he is in fact referring to God's energies, as St. Basil and Gregory call them, and as they've been and are called in the broader Orthodox patristic tradition. Nonetheless, his use of the term dynamis, meaning power, as opposed to energia, the word for energy, is very convenient for my exposition of the historical development of this distinction, because it's the word used by Clement to denote God's interactions with us and the rest of creative reality. I should at this point add that energia has often in the past been rendered in a theological context as operation or activity. Of these 2 alternative translations, I prefer activity, not only because operation has a rather clinical or impersonal connotations, but also because activity conveys more effectively the sense that God is actively involved in his creation by way of his providence, as St. Athanasius makes clear, and is not some remote and purely transcendent God of the philosophers, to borrow Pascal's language. I think it's very important for all of us to be aware of this variation in terminology, since English translations of Orthodox liturgical texts, even today, frequently render occurrences of energia, whether in the singular or the plural, as activity or even operation, and tend thereby to obscure the dogmatic content of a given hymn. Now, In order to illustrate the apophatic approach to theology, I'll quote 3 sections from St. Gregory's Life of Moses, so bear with me, it's a longer quote. But it goes as follows. What does it mean that Moses entered the darkness and saw God in it? What is now recounted seems somehow to be contradictory to the first theophany, for then the divine was beheld in light, but now he is seen in darkness. Let us not think that this is at variance with the sequence of things we have contemplated anagogically. Scripture teaches by this that religious knowledge comes to those who receive it at first as light. Therefore, what is perceived to be contrary to true religion is darkness, and the turning away from darkness comes about when one participates in light. But as the mind progresses, and through an ever greater and more perfect diligence comes to apprehend reality, as it approaches more nearly to divine vision, it sees more clearly what of the divine nature is uncontemplated. For leaving behind everything that is observed, not only what sense comprehends, but also what the intellect thinks it sees, it keeps on penetrating deeper until by the intelligence's, maybe the mind's yearning for understanding, it gains access to the invisible and the incomprehensible, and there it sees God. This is the true knowledge of what is sought. This is the seeing. It consists in not seeing, because that which is sought transcends all knowledge, being separated on all sides by incomprehensibility as by a kind of darkness. Hence, John the Sublime, who penetrated into the luminous darkness, says, "No one hath ever seen God," thus asserting that knowledge of the divine essence is unattainable not only by men, but also by every intelligent nature. That includes the angels, of course. When therefore Moses grew in knowledge, he declared that he had seen God in the darkness, that is, he had then come to know that what is divine is beyond all knowledge and comprehension. For the text says, Moses entered the darkness where God was. What God? He who made darkness his hiding place, as David says, who also was initiated into the mysteries in the same inner sanctuary. Now, before I present Clement's contribution to the doctrine of the divine energies, or powers, I'll cite passages from 2 of the most prominent 2nd century apologists, named St. Justin the Philosopher, perhaps better known as St. Justin Martyr or just Justin Martyr, and St. Theophilos of Antioch. The first passage is from St. Justin's second apology. He says, "These words, Father and God and Creator and Lord and Master, are not names, but appellations derived from his good deeds and works. This is not exactly the uncreated divine energies as we know them from the more mature patristic literature. St. Justin may be interpreted, though, as suggesting it's from God's works that we form the idea of his energies or powers. That is indeed a matter of experience, and it is, after all, upon their experience of God that the Fathers based their theological writings." The second passage is from St. Theophilus' work of Autolycos. He says, "The form of God is ineffable and inexpressible, since it cannot be seen with merely human eyes. For he is in glory uncontainable, in greatness incomprehensible, in loftiness inconceivable, in strength incomparable, in wisdom unrivaled, in goodness inimitable, in beneficence inexpressible." Now in this passage, when he speaks of God's form, which in Greek is ethos, it's the same word Plato uses for his forms, and the theory of forms so-called, St. Theophilus is in all likelihood referring to the divine essence. If we may extrapolate from the Greek word morphe, which is understood by St. Gregory and of Nyssa and other fathers of his time as denoting essence or nature. That's particularly important when we consider the passage from Philippians 2, when St. Paul says that Christ, being in the form of God, thought it not robbery to be equal of God, and so on. In the form of God means in the essence or nature of God. Okay. Well, the ensuing words, glory, wisdom, goodness, and beneficence, are all examples of terms indicative of the various divine energies. Thus, already in the late 2nd century, there are church fathers who have some conception of the difference between God's ineffable essence and his manifold energies, or as St. Dionysius would express it, processions, that is to say, God's outgoings toward creation. I think we are now in a position to examine 3 significant texts by Clement in which he evinces a clearer understanding of the distinction between the divine essence and the divine energies, or powers, to use his terminology. All these passages will be found in the Stromatis. There are at least 2 passages in the Instructor, the Pedagogos, a work which, as best we can determine, was written before the Stromatis and was intended to serve as an introduction to that work. Time constraints, however, render their inclusion in the present lecture unfeasible. If you're interested, I can refer you to those passages, and there are other passages that I'm not touching on here because of, again, time constraints, but I chose three that I think are most important. And actually, I'll just explain that this whole endeavor arose from an initiative that Father Gregory Telpeneff and I undertook last year, along with Dr. John, to read Clement, just to get familiar with him, and that's what this whole colloquium grew out of. And we've kept finding, as we read Clement, to great surprise and delight, more and more of these very important, supposedly much more mature Orthodox ideas. Well, they are maturely expressed, but they're ideas that go back a lot further than we realized, and found so much of this in Clement. It was very exciting to discover this. Well, the first text is in Book 2 of the Stromatis, a chapter entitled, in the Standard English translation, "The knowledge of God can be attained only through faith." Clement begins by commenting on chapter 3 of Proverbs, and then cites several verses from the Wisdom of Solomon, which speak of God's wisdom, that is, the Logos, the second person of the Trinity, bestowing upon man the unerring knowledge of things that exist, namely to know the composition of the world and the operation of the elements, the beginning, ending, and midst of the times, the alterations of the turning of the sun and changes of seasons, the circuits of years and positions of stars, the natures of living creatures and the furies of wild beasts, the violence of winds and the reasonings of men, the diversities of plants and the virtues of roots, all such things as are kept either secret or manifest. That's Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 7. Now Clement goes on to identify the aforementioned gifts of God with natural contemplation, in Greek physiki theoria. This can be understood in part as a reference to the natural sciences, which deal with phenomena in the world of the senses. The final verse in this quotation, "and all such things as are either secret or manifest," seems to hint at the study of intelligible things, noita, by which Clement might mean, for example, the forms of Platonic philosophy. It is not clear exactly what he means. Now, in these verses in the Wisdom of Solomon, the Alexandrian tells us you have, in brief, the professed aim of our philosophy, and the learning of these branches, when practiced with a right way of life, i.e. orthopraxy, leads upward through wisdom, the artificer of all things, to the ruler of all, Pandokrator, that is, either a being or a thing. The Greek text is a little awkward there, but let's say a being, for the sake of argument, difficult to grasp and hunt down, ever receding and withdrawing far from him who pursues. Now, the final two clauses of this sentence are thoroughly apophatic in tone, suggesting as they do that God is elusive in his essence and beyond the scope of our normal cognitive faculties. But Clement immediately reassures us that the same one who is far off has, O ineffable marvel, come very near. I am a God nigh at hand, says the Lord, prophet Jeremiah. He is in essence remote, for how is it that what is begotten can have approach to the unbegotten? But he is very near in virtue of that power which holds all things in its embrace. Shall one do aught in secret, and I see him not? Prophet Jeremiah again. For the power of God is always present, in contact with us by a power which is, well, I've got the translation observant, really superintending, supervisory. It's not a very easy word to translate. Epoptiki is the word. But beneficent and educative or instructive. In these sentences, Clement deftly captures the distinction between God's essence, whereby he is distant from us, and his power, energy or energies, whereby he is close to us, and this right after a passage in which he speaks of God in apophatic terms. They're also strikingly similar to the passage of St. Athanasius, which I cited above, which they could be said to anticipate. Given their common Alexandrian intellectual and spiritual milieu, it is not inconceivable that St. Athanasius knew Clement's writings and drew from them. That's the subject perhaps of further research. And yet, there is more. Moses, persuaded that God is never to be known by human wisdom, said, "Show thyself to me," and compels himself to enter into the thick darkness where God's voice was, that is, into the inaccessible and unfathomable, or perhaps better, formless ideas concerning either him who is or that which is. I think it is actually him who is. And by the way, that verse is from Exodus chapter 33, verse 18. It's a very important passage in Exodus. Well, he goes on, for God is not in darkness or in place, but above both space and time, and that which is proper to created things. In this section, Clement draws heavily on Philo's, the Alexandrians, Philo Judaeus, Philo's treatise on the posterity of Cain and his exile, in which Philo writes as follows: so see him, that is Moses, enter into the thick darkness, gnophos, where God was, that is, into conceptions regarding him who is that, regarding him who is, that's one word, regarding him who is, which belonged to the unapproachable region where there are no material forms. For the cause of all is not in the thick darkness, nor locally in any place at all, but high above both place and time. While neither Clement nor Philo achieves the profundity of St. Gregory of Nyssa in the passage from St. Gregory's Life of Moses, quoted above, they are at least putting us on the right path to a prophetic discourse about God. And it's worth keeping in mind, we discovered in reading Clement with the critical edition at hand, looking at the footnotes, that he freely takes quotations from Philo with no acknowledgement. So this was in an era when there was no copyright laws, and you wouldn't be sued. It was also probably considered a sign of respect for someone more wise than you, if you would take his works, but it's certainly very strange. And the English translation in the Ante-Nicene Fathers series, which by the way is not accurate, it's not very good, makes almost no mention of this. So the English reader has no clue where this is coming from. If you look at the Greek text, critical text, has all the quotations from Philo and other authors at the bottom of the page, so you know where he's getting his ideas from. But I don't think it was out of the lack of originality on his part. It's just that he had great respect for Philo. He thought Philo was onto some very important truths here. And Philo, as you know, was Jewish. He was thoroughly Hellenized Jew, never became a Christian, unfortunately, but very close in some ways. Some fathers, like St. Jerome, even call him like an honorary father, I mean, in an informal way, that is to say, because he seems so close in some ways, though he didn't quite get there, unfortunately. Well, the second text is in Book 5 of the Stromatis, in a chapter entitled The Abstraction from Material Things is Necessary in order to attain to the true knowledge of God. Borrowing liberally for his exposition of this topic from Philo, Clement explains how pagan Greeks, quote, deified the Gnostic life, that is, regard as divine the life of what he calls, or the person he calls, the Gnostic. This is Gnostic with a G, and this, by the way, I think is one reason why some people are suspicious of Clement, because he talks about the Gnostikos, the perfect Christian, the one who's attained all the virtues, who's attained to the pinnacle of a holy way of life. It's absolutely no way, has absolutely no connection with the pseudo-Christian, pseudo-Jewish mishmash known as Gnosticism. Absolutely nothing to do with that. Actually, you may have used the word in order to reclaim it from the Gnostics, to give it a Christian meaning. But don't be put off, you see, the word Gnostic. It's nothing to do with those very bizarre systems of thought. The Gnostic is a man who's attained to the pinnacle of spiritual knowledge. His Eminence Grace mentioned this earlier in his talk. That word is gnosis, of course. That's where we get Gnostic from. With reference to practices of the Greek mystery religions, such as purification through water in the form of lustrations, like a pagan mimicry or imitation of baptism, perhaps, or anticipation of baptism. It's not then without reason in the mysteries that obtain among the Greeks, that is, the pagans, lustrations hold the first place, as also the laver among the barbarians. This is Clement's ironic and self-deprecating name for the Christians. He calls his fellow Christians himself barbarians, almost as a kind of joke here, because of course they aren't barbarians, strictly speaking. And after these are the minor mysteries, which have some foundation of instruction and a preliminary preparation of what is to come after. and the great mysteries in which nothing remains to be learned of the universe, only to contemplate and comprehend nature and things. He then proceeds to compare the spiritual stages of purification and contemplation to the geometrical procedures of discovering correspondences and proportions in order to illustrate the philosophical method of abstraction, apheresis, abstracting from the body its physical properties, taking away the dimension of depth, then that of breadth, and then that of length, such that the point which remains is a unit, so to speak, having position, from which, if we abstract position, there is a conception of unity. In a similar way, he continues, if abstracting all that belongs to bodies and things called incorporeal, we cast ourselves into the greatness of Christ and thence advance into the immensity, or perhaps the abyss, depending how you interpret that word, by way of holiness, we may reach somehow to the conception of the Almighty, knowing not what he is, but what he is not. I'm going to repeat that. We may reach somehow to the conception of the Almighty, knowing not what he is, but what he is not. This is by far and away one of the most significant expressions of apophaticism in Clement's writings. What's even more remarkable is it anticipates an equally important affirmation of what we might call philosophical apophaticism in Plotinus, the great Neoplatonist, who asks in his fifth Ennead, number 3, how then do we speak about it, the one? That's, remember, there are 3 levels of reality, to use the modern terminology, or 3 hypostases. The one, the intellect or nous, and the soul, psyche. The one is the ineffable, transcendent entity, which is, in some ways, is Plotinus's version of God. It's not entirely clear how we can really tie those two together. But anyway, this is how the quotation goes. How do we speak about it? How do we speak about the one? In fact, we do speak in some measure about it. That's the key word, is about. We don't speak it, which sounds a little odd in English, I know. We don't speak it directly, nor do we have knowledge or intellection or understanding of it. How then do we speak about it if we do not have knowledge or intellection of it? In fact, if we don't have knowledge of it, does it follow as well that we do not have it at all? And he responds, but we have it in such a way that we can speak about it, though we can't speak it. For, and here's the key words, we say what it is not. What it is, we do not say. Now think about what I just read from Clement about reaching the conception of the Almighty, knowing not what he is, but what he is not. Here, Plotinus is saying about the one, and speaking about the one, which is very difficult, it's almost impossible, for we say what it is not. What it is, we do not say. So we're speaking about it on the basis of things posterior to it, or subsequent to it. It almost sounds like energies to me. We're not prevented from having it, even though we don't say it. That's what Plotinus says in Ennead 5:3. So we can't utter the one. We can only speak about it, do a kind of a roundabout way. In essence, the one is ineffable. In quote-unquote energies, we might say, to use Christian terms, it is expressible and maybe knowable in some ways. It's interesting to speculate whether Plotinus might have been familiar with Clement's thinking, perhaps even read some of his works. We don't know. But the parallel between his and Clement's apophaticism is too striking, I think, to be written off as a mere coincidence. That's my take on it, at any rate, for what it's worth. If Clement did indeed influence Plotinus, then Clement should be accorded due honor in the history of Greek philosophy, which he currently is not, for the most part, though that is beginning to change, thankfully. Well, in what follows, Clement reiterates that the first cause is not then in space, but above both space and time and name and understanding, adopting Philo's term for God from his work on the posterity of Cain. Clement then cites Exodus 33:18, in which Moses pleads with God, show thyself to me, just as he had in Book 2, intimating most clearly that God is not capable of being taught by man or expressed in speech, to be known only by his own power. For the object of inquiry is without form and invisible, but the grace of knowledge is from him through the Son. So he, in this way, echoes a gloss by Philo on the aforementioned verse of Exodus at Moses, showing quite clearly by so saying, show thyself to me, that there is not a single created being capable of attaining by his own efforts the knowledge of God who verily exists, the truly existing one, he who is, in other words. The third text, and this is the last one, I'm almost finished, is also found in Book 5, the Stromatis, in a chapter entitled God Cannot Be Embraced in words or by the mind. In one section of this chapter, Clement speaks about the absolutely first and oldest principle, which is the cause of all other things being and having been, i.e. God without form or name. And he continues, if we name it, it is only improperly that we call it either the one or the good or mind or absolute being or Father or God or Creator or Lord. We speak not as supplying his name, but for want of anything better, we use good names in order that the mind may have these as points of support so as not to err in other respects. For each one by itself does not express God, but all together are indicative of the power of the Almighty, i.e. the energy of the Almighty. Predicates are expressed either from what belongs to things themselves or from their mutual relation, but none of these are admissible in reference to God. This is quite reminiscent of what St. Justin maintains about the namelessness of God, except that Clement puts forward the advisability of using what he calls good names, perhaps we might say by economy, so that the faithful will have some point of reference in their Christian life, not fall into any kind of agnosticism. I concur with Henny Hegg's comment at one of the most recent books on Clement, a very good book on Clement. She comments that Clement knows this practice of naming God to be logically incorrect, but it must be tolerated for the sake of our helplessness, our weakness, our poor humanity. Okay. At any rate, St. Justin and Clement both apply the divine names to God's immanent, indwelling energies, that is, not to his transcendent essence. Well, in conclusion, I hope that I've succeeded, at least in some measure, in showing how important Clement is to the gradual development of the clear articulation of one of the central issues in Orthodox dogmatic theology, and why he should be held in greater honor by us Orthodox. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Father, for your instructive and illuminating lecture. Thereby you walked us through what are two very important and fundamental concepts of Orthodox theology. The apophatic theology, the apophatic character of theology, and the essence energies distinction. So let me ask you, Father, in later fathers after Saint Clement, we see clearly that in understanding of church fathers, both concept, apophatic theology and essence energy distinction, that they have its source, its founding source in the living experience of saint. So we have someone who progressed in his spiritual life, and at some point he was given a spiritual gift, experience of the vision of God. And through this vision, he understands at least two things: that what I see, what I experience, is really divine, because it has no similarity with anything around me for the first time I see it.
Yeah.
So, but in the same time, he gets another insight that although I see there is some, and it's uncreated, it's God, but there is something in God which really still escapes my ability. So can we find something, so this personal or experiential dimension regarding those two concepts in St. Clement?
Well, I think the part I quoted about God kind of running away from us, we can't grasp him. I think he used that kind of metaphorical language to depict the difficulty of apprehending God. I mean, he's almost, we're hunting after him, he's running away from us. Usually it's God running after us to try to bring us back. That's using his energies, of course, to reach out to us, come down to us. But in this case, God is, as it were, making himself hidden. And that's another theme that I could have mentioned here, the hiddenness of God. It's an idea that's increasingly talked about in contemporary philosophy of religion, but it's God is not obvious. I mean, and yet if you open your eyes, you can actually look. If you look at the world and you see the created order and the beauty and so on, the typical motif that we'd follow, you can see that God exists, but what he is, of course, you don't know. I have to explore Clement more to be able to answer properly that very good question, because it's this whole Clement is a prolix author. He tends to ramble somewhat. It's a little difficult to find your way through him. We'll talk more about that perhaps tomorrow in our discussion, but thank you for that question. I have to think more about that. Perhaps I could, as I look through Clement more, I'll keep an eye out for those kind of motifs. Thank you, Father.
And Father, and what does your reading of Saint Clement tell you about his sources regarding apophatic theology and energy distinction? And if you can prioritize, what is your
my sense is it's from Philo primarily, but I think he uses Philo perhaps as a lens through which to view Scripture. Even though Philo was Jewish, I think he found the fact that he quotes him so liberally without acknowledging him. I think it's very clear that Philo is important. I don't know what else he read though. I mean, whether he read St. Justin and the earlier apologists, I'm not quite sure. I tend to think of Clement as being one of the last of the apologists. I mean, Origen could be seen as that with Contra Celsum, but Clement certainly strikes one as being, especially in that exhortation to the heathen, or to the pagans, the Protrepticos, that's very much in the vein of apologetics. So I suspect he must have been familiar with the writings of his predecessors in that school of thought, but I don't know exactly what. But by looking at the critical text, you can see a lot of the sources. I mean, Plato is hugely important for him. I didn't detect Aristotle very much in Clement's thinking. There probably is there somewhere, but of course the other influence I didn't touch on. I didn't really have time to, unfortunately. But it'd be interesting for the sake of comparison. The Middle Platonists, that's extremely important. Alcinous, particularly Numenius and Atticus, those are the three who are usually cited in this regard. Alcinous is particularly important in his work, Didascalicos, the Handbook of Platonism. It's a marvelous work to read. It's a really great summary of Platonism as it was in the intermediate period between the Old Academy and the Neoplatonists. So he clearly had drunk deeply at that philosophical well, and he drew from that for some of his thinking. I'm afraid to have time either touch on the issue of the Logos, because that's another dimension of this is Logos, the Athetos and Prophorikos and so on.
My following question. So how, in your eyes,
how
how does St. Clement balance apophatic and cataphatic theology through the apocalyptic role or revelatory role of the Logos?
I think I would venture to suggest that the Logos gives a more cataphatic element because he's God speaking to us and revealing himself to us. So I would, if I hadn't reflected enough on that particular issue, but I will think more about it. But I think that's what I would probably answer. I don't know if it's a good answer or not, but it's I didn't really think much about the cataphatic way because I concentrate on the apophatic. And one thing I wanted to mention is that it's very easy to make a kind of simplistic scheme whereby you have essence, and then the energy. So apophatic theology takes care of the essence, as it were. Cataphatic, affirmative theology takes care of the energies. But in fact, the energies themselves are often called indescribable. God's judgments are inscrutable. His goodness is called indescribable, among other things. I mean, so the energies themselves, although God reaches down to us through the energies and enables us to speak, say, as it were, positive things about him, are still mysterious. And we can't really pretend we've plumbed the depths of those in any way because they're uncreated after all. And so anytime we try to reach from the created to the uncreated using language, of course, belongs to the created realm, we're going to have problems. So, but I would like to thank you for that suggestion. I'm going to try to think more about that as I go through Clement and the related writers. It's a very good question. I don't have an easy answer for that, but if you have any thoughts on that, please let me know, because you read more of this than I have. I certainly would.
If I can, one more?
Yeah.
One more question.
Thank you.
And since Father, now we have just mentioned like kind of distorted understanding of the essence energy distinction. Essence is on the level of apophatic theology, essence,
right.
Affirmative or cataphatic theology on the level of energies. And since now in the first, I think, third of your lecture, you mentioned something from the history of Orthodox theology and how, especially due to Vladimir Lossky, the Orthodox academical theology was reminded or discovered. It was kind of revolution, and Vladimir Lossky reminded us of both those two absolutely fundamental concept, negatival apophatic theology and essence energy distinction. And now, what would you say? There are those who gives credential to Vladimir Lossky that it was really turning point work, but that in some sense he didn't express the essence energy distinction in the best possible way, or that there is he presented the patristic understanding of essence energies distinction and of the concept of apophatic theology based on that. In some sense that reminds of detheism, that it's something like real ontological distinction which separates essence from energies, and that in this sense he, how to say, he went against this rediscovery of apophatic theology, so that he was so adamant in defending the essence energies distinction that he forgot about apophatic theology, and he presented it like in in absolute clear, positive, affirmative way. I don't know, what is your
I would tend to agree with you on that. Yeah, from what I've seen, I haven't read him for quite a while, but I think what you're saying points to the importance of viewing these two themes as being closely linked together, inextricably linked together. In fact, you can't really talk about one without the other. So I think it's perhaps he was a little absolutist, as you say, in some of his rigid, perhaps in some of his thinking. But I think it's largely to him we owe the rediscovery, the vitality and the indispensability of apophatic discourse for Orthodox theology. I think everyone's deeply in his debt for that, but maybe there are some shortcomings there that we'll have to be aware of as we read his work. So I think that's a good point, Father. Yeah, thank you very much for your comments.
If the jury is still out regarding the question of Clement's canonization, and I think Father Gregory made a compelling case this morning, I would like, with due respect, to urge that he be awarded a posthumous Nobel Prize for Christian philosophy, with Origen as co-recipient. The Nobel Committee's citation would reiterate the judgment of the late Metropolitan Callistus where, which I quote, "Together with his philosophical successor Origen, Clement is the co-founder of Christian philosophy. Both undoubtedly took their cue from the biblical philosophy of Philo. Both formulated the main features of Eastern mystical theology." And I should, end of quote, I should add that the late Metropolitan called Clement Saint Clement in his best-selling book on the history of the Orthodox Church. Well, in the next few minutes, I shall explain my reasons, the reasons for my proposal. Titus Flavius Clemens, a pagan convert born perhaps in Athens around 150, completed his higher education in Alexandria after travels across the eastern Mediterranean. Like St. Paul at Athens and second-century apologists, Clement consciously presented himself to his highly educated, well-heeled audiences as thoroughly partaking in the intellectual culture, the paideia, of the Roman Empire. His exhortation to the pagans, a lengthy critique of pagan mystery cults, brims with classical learning and shows him to be the great missionary to the well-educated rich. His Paidagogos offers stoicizing practical and spiritual instruction for recent converts or the newly baptized, all of whom are still children in need of their instructor, Christ the Logos. The work must have dazzled its audiences with its strange facts about pregnancy, the use of the mastic tree as a source of chewing gum, and the deplorable mating habits of female hyenas. Clement even pays incidental attention to oral hygiene in Pedagogos, Book 2, Chapter 7, while outlining rules of modesty, cleanliness, and physical discipline for Christians. He condemns excessive or noisy practices such as scraping the teeth with gusto, which, as he cautions, makes gums bleed and annoys one's neighbors. His Stromates is even more impressive. It truly is a treasure trove, packed with quotes and incidental information. The author states, for example, that animals, like their human counterparts, speak different dialects, and that Greeks use the Koine, the dialect of the New Testament. He also mentions the Buddha, as you learnt this morning, or heard this morning. This church writer laid the foundations for the Alexandrian school of allegorical and typological interpretation. And as the Oxford Dictionary of Byzantium notes, and I quote, he paved the way for the incorporation of pagan learning within Christianity, end of quote. What is more, as Catherine Osborne has remarked, he developed a new style of allegorical interpretation, advancing over Philo. He allegorized Homer and other poets, extracting from them doctrinal and other spiritual content. This is a subject for another lecture. His masterpiece is the Stromates, sometimes known as the Stromata. In its present form, the work is a massive miscellany of 8 surviving books, conceived as a collage of comments on insights and information from Christian, Jewish, and pagan sources. The comments are actually the record of conversations in his younger days with an unspecified spiritual father. By his own admission in Book 1, the very beginning, Clement progressively gathers particles of the Logos seeded throughout human thought as he rehearses his material. The work, despite its sprawling structure, is discriminating and systematic, as Professor Osborne points out. The main title of the work is «I κατά την αληθή φιλοσοφίαν γνωστικών υπομνημάτων Stromatis», the patchwork of spiritual or enlightened notes according to the true philosophy. That's text number 3 on the handout. The texts are not in numerical order. Stromates is the plural of stromatefs, meaning coverlet, tapestry, or patchwork quilt, a term that suggests the collecting and recombining of notes or memoranda, hypomnemata. The author selected, excerpted, paraphrased, and commented on 400 texts, that's the latest tally, 363 of them pagan, drawn chiefly from the authors of the late antique Enkyclios Paideia, the basic education system. About half of his pagan citations are taken from Plato. The first 5 books concern ethical questions. The remaining 2 deal with the practice of religion, including the interpretation or misinterpretation of the scriptures by heretics. The coverlets are formally comparable with the prose miscellanies of the early empire, in particular Plutarch's Problemata Symposiaca, Pliny's Naturalis Historia, Gellius's Noctes Atticae, and Athenaeus's Deipnos Sophistae. Jane Heath, in her recent book on Clement, discerns an aesthetics of miscellanism, as she calls it, the aesthetics of poikilia, diversity. The networks of texts in the Stromates are intended as a course in Christian formation from which the reader, preferably guided by a teacher reading along with him, will graduate. By books 6 or 7, as a true gnostic, gnostikos, and somebody with insight, and will by book 6 or 7 attain to likeness to God. Homeosis or homeosis was achieved through intellectual virtue and apathia, and was the telos, the end, and the purpose, the object of Christian education. St. Paul's address before the Council of the Areopagus, as reported or fictionalized or invented in Acts 17, created the model of the philosophic protreptic to the new faith, the missionary's speech, and licensed openness to pagan literature. Speaking before a cosmopolitan audience that included philosophers, Paul mustered his most elegant rhetorical style, building his arguments on Stoic natural religion, on the premise that, and I quote, Gentiles had some access to the nature of God. His observation to the Areopagites that, and I quote, the one whom you worship without knowing him I proclaim to you, that's verse 23, this hinted at, according to Paul, at the immanent logos that St. Justin Martyr later invoked in his apology to Marcus Aurelius when explaining the parallels between Socrates and Jesus. The hexameter versicule, for we are also his offspring, tu gar kai genos esmen, it's a hexameter, it's part of a hexameter, that's verse 28 in Paul's text. That is a verbatim quote from the proem, the preface of Aratus's poem Phenomena, dating from the early 3rd century BC. The proem celebrates Zeus as the pantheistic material principle permeating the universe. Paul's quote shows him to be adapting his pitch to his pagan audience, especially its Stoic members. Clement acknowledged this in text 2a, that's from book 1, and I quote, from this it is clear that by using poetic examples from the phenomena of Aratus, he approves the best statements of the Greeks. Besides, he refers to the fact that in the person of the unknown God, the Greeks are indirectly honoring God the Creator and need to receive him and learn about him with full knowledge through the Son, end of quote. In Book 6.2, Clement explicitly recognizes Paul's evangelizing strategy of interspersing his arguments with pagan quotes and allusions and seeking common ground with an alien culture. But, like St. Paul, he did not hold pagan and Christian sources of divine revelation as equivalent. The apostle was Clement's immediate authorizing model, as he notes in Book 6, and that is text number 4. I quote, for Paul too, in the epistles, plainly does not disparage philosophy, but deems it unworthy of the Gnostic man any longer to go back to the Hellenic philosophy, figuratively calling it the rudiments of this world, as being most rudimentary and a preparatory training for the truth. Under Clement's reading, St. Paul considered philosophy an elementary preparation for the faith. Profane philosophy is all well and good, he would say, but you must advance beyond it. At some point, you will no longer need to read Plato, but will turn exclusively to the scriptures. Clement's attitude toward philosophy has then a Pauline warrant. The apostle also considered the Torah to be the childminder or temporary constricting custodian, the paidagogos of the Jews until the revelation of the faith. This idea as well shaped Clement's view of the Jewish scriptures. Under the influence of St. Justin Martyr, Clement ventured a step further, I suggest, and approached the Torah and Plato as more than mere paidagogoi, childminders of Jews and Gentiles alike. These twin sources became full-fledged educators, teachers, and the function, if not the status, of philosophy was very similar to that of the Bible. In fact, philosophy, Clement asserted in Book 1, is needed for the interpretation of the scriptures. On what grounds did Clement defend the near equivalence of the philosophy and the Bible of Plato and Moses? What did he mean by philosophy? Let's consider the second question first. He defines the term thus, that's text 11, and I quote, "When I speak of philosophy, I do not mean Stoic, Platonic, Epicurean, or Aristotelian. I apply the term philosophy to all that is rightly said in each of these schools, all that teaches righteousness combined with a scientific knowledge of religion, the complete eclectic unity." You see, "Tuto sumban to eclecticon philosophian me." And this puts me in mind of St. Paul, 1 Thessalonians 5:21. I quote, "Test everything and hold firmly on to that which is good." What is striking, our author suggests that if these schools combined the best of their tenets, they would arrive at the comprehensive truth. He says that in 157. On their own, the opinions ta doxazomena of philosophical sects, Greek and non-Greek, including presumably Egyptian, Indian, Buddhist, and so forth, are comparable with the disiecta membra of Dionysus and seeds of the seminal logos fallen on foreign soil. The Platonist Numenius in the 2nd century AD, too, used the imagery of Pentheus's scattered body, his disiecta membra, to articulate how the sects, the philosophical sects, scattered truth within the world or throughout the world. The kaleidoscope of seed-like opinions approaches to the truth and accounts for the variety of types of wisdom. The stromatase, as an aggregative genre, lent themselves to canvassing this staggering variety. From a forced allegorical interpretation of Proverbs 4:10 and following, that's text T11a, I won't read, well, I can read it. "Hear, my son, and accept my words to have many paths of life. I am teaching you the ways of wisdom," and so on. Well, from this, what I think is rather forced, a forced allegorical interpretation, Clement extrapolates a highly influential hermeneutic anthropological principle. That's text 12, which I quote, an extraordinary text or passage. "There is only one way of truth, but different paths from different places join it, like tributaries flowing into a perennial river." That's from Book 1. In Greek, mia men un itis alithias odos, and so on. Mia coming at the very emphatic beginning of the sentence. This confluence is possible because all human beings participate in the universal logos, the Stoic doctrine. On the basis of the tenet of the emphytos logos, innate reason, Justin Martyr, in his so-called Apology 2, had earlier argued that certain biblical Jews and classical Greeks were actually Christians avant la lettre, since they were inspired by Christ, the eternal Logos. In similar fashion, pagans like the anti-Christian Celsus, a contemporary Clement argued around 180 that rationality made all human beings capable of achieving revelation and wisdom. So it was something in the air. For Clement, the flowing together of tributaries into the river Logos explained the convergences in culture, lifestyle, and especially education and philosophy between pagans and Christians. It was this affirmative attitude that made St. Paul's overture to the Athenian philosophers possible. The tributaries metaphor, if it is tributaries, but it does rather sound like one. He mentions odos, but he does mention also a potamos. So we're dealing with a metaphor, a larger metaphor of a river and tributaries. Well, this metaphor was but one reason, one answer to the question, how did Greek philosophers discover bits of true philosophy? It's a question he poses. There are several other possibilities apart from the Logos argument, and I shall mention the key ones. First, they discovered bits of true philosophy and even the truth by accident, kata periptosin, occasioned by divine dispensation, thea economia, by happy coincidence, kata syndichian, arranged by providence as well, through an innate notion of natural law, physiki enia, instilled in them by God their creator. This is related, I think, to the river metaphor. By virtue of the common mind, kinos nous, with which their father had endowed them. Owing to the divine element in them, to theon, certain Greeks were able to philosophize accurately, or more or less accurately, and to discern God indirectly, as if through water. And this phrase puts us in mind of Plato in the Republic. And finally, the Greeks acquired philosophy by stealing it, filching it like Prometheus when he stole fire. Sometimes, however, they willfully distorted the stolen property. So that's your text 13. I won't read it. But Greek philosophers were robbers and bandits. The Greeks at least had the good sense to steal from the best source. Greek thinkers borrowed or stole from the Bible itself because they were convinced by it. By the way, Greek philosophers and poets also stole from one another, according to Clement. He will next note the Jewish philosopher Aristobulus, probably of the second half of the 2nd century. He will quote him as saying that Plato used a pre-Hellenistic translation of the Torah, from which both he and Pythagoras borrowed much. This prompts Clement to quote Numenius's famous question, "What is Plato but Moses speaking Greek?" Aristobulus, Philo, St. Justin Martyr, Numenius, and the Assyrian apologist Tatian accused the Greeks of plagiarizing the Jewish scriptures wholesale. Clement followed Tatian in giving this thesis a polemical anti-Hellenic edge, as Henry Chadwick remarks. And Chadwick adds, and I quote, "The plagiarism theme is developed by Clement more than by any other Christian writer," end of quote. In Book 2, our author will note, as did Justin, that the Greeks also copied Christian doctrines and miracle accounts. When they stole ideas from barbarian, i.e., Jewish philosophy, Greek philosophers often muddled details, a criticism that the Syrian anti-Christian and anti-Greek philosopher Porphyry was to repeat some 50 years later. Books 5 and 6 exhaustively list instances in which philosophers supposedly arrived at erroneous doctrines by misunderstanding the Old Testament. Despite this shortcoming, Plato did often get things right, and Greek philosophy, being less obscure than Scripture, was useful. This is very important. Greek philosophy, being less obscure than Scripture, was useful in approaching Scripture, which was more obscure. It's a reversal, you might say, of the principle obscurum per obscurius. Our author begins Book 5, Chapter 12, that's T13a on your text handout. He begins by quoting Timaeus' statement in Plato Timaeus about the maker or creator and father of the universe. That's T14. Now to discover the maker and father of this universe would be a task indeed. And having discovered him, to declare him to all men would be an impossible thing. It's a very famous quotation. In fact, it is one of the most popular post-classical cliches and was repeated in philosophical education from the 1st century AD on. Justin Martyr, for instance, cites it in Apology 2. The section of Book 12 that I am discussing is indebted to Philo's Life of Moses. Clement states that Plato heard or read, it may be, about the theophany on Mount Sinai. The thick darkness, the gnophos, into which Moses entered according to Exodus, Clement suggests, inspired Plato's statement about the unknowability of the Father of the cosmos. Indeed, God is invisible, aoratos, and inexpressible in words, aretos. Well done, Plato, says Clement. Like Philo, our author complemented his apophatic theology by using the Timaeus. In Clement's hands, Plato and Moses become mutually reinforcing. Now, a little further in the same book, this is Book 5, it's not on the handout, our author takes up the second part of the Timaeus passage, i.e., to declare him to all men would be an impossible thing or task. I shall not discuss the passage except to note that Clement has here cited Solon, the elegiac poet of the 6th century, Empedocles, the pre-Socratic philosopher and poet, St. John 1:18, no man hath seen God at any time, the only begotten God who is in the bosom of the Father, he hath declared him. So he goes through reams of material, pagan and Christian, to document the idea of the unknowability of God. In the treatment that follows, he makes exuberant use of Platonic and Aristotelian terms and concepts, especially from logic, to argue for God's unnamability, his transcendence of categorization and predication, and his unknowability. Now, if we were to look at the original text, we would notice nouns on your handout and adjectives such as genos, which is genus or genus, applied by Plato in the Parmenides and by Aristotle in Topics, eidos, species, used by Plato and Aristotle in Metaphysics, diaphora, differentia of species, that's Aristotelian, and so on and so forth. And you will notice that many of the, or most of the adjectives are, and some of these adjectives are used as nouns, they all begin with a privative alpha, which is typical of apophatic discourse about the Godhead. So you will notice anephyctos, unreachable, aperandos, without bounds, adieritos, indivisible, and so on and so forth. The Church Father uses the term episteme apodektikiae, Aristotle's term for a demonstrative deduction from necessary principles. I suppose it means syllogism. The demonstration, Clement says, of God's existence is not possible inasmuch as it depends on known first principles. And here I'm overlapping with His Grace, so I won't go any further into this. But he ends his section on the transcendence of God by harking back to the agnostos theos, the centerpiece of St. Paul's speech at Athens. Negative theology, couched in Platonic and Aristotelian language, becomes apostolic. In chapter 14 of the same book, this is book 5, Clement repeats the opening of the Timaeus passage. It is a difficult task to find the maker and father of this universe, and reads it as confirmation of the creation account of the book of Genesis. That's text 14. As a Christian, Clement held that God created the world ex nihilo, ek me ondos, he says, unlike most philosophers, with the exception, as he says, of the Stoics. Another Platonic cliché, that of becoming like God as far as possible, became a pervasive idiom in Orthodox mystical theology, thanks to Clement and his successor, Origen. The commonplace was seized upon by Middle Platonists and later by Neoplatonists. It is Theaetetus, the passage on the handout, it's T16. But it is impossible that evils should be done away with, Theodorus, for there must always be something opposed to the good, and they cannot have their place among the gods, but must inevitably hover about mortal nature and this earth. Therefore, we ought to try to escape from earth to the dwelling of the gods as quickly as we can, and to escape is to become like God, so far as this is possible. And to become like God is to become righteous and holy and wise. Ομοίωσης, I'll do it in Church Greek, ομοίωσης δε δίκαιον και όσιον μεταφρονήσεως γενέσθε. Saints Irenaeus of Lyon, St. Justin Martyr, Theophilus of Antioch, and others had previously cited the passage. But it was Clement who worked out the technical vocabulary of deification, as Heath shows in her book. Clement alone cites or alludes to the passage more than 20 times in his works. In Book 2, he accurately states that Plato equated happiness, Clement uses an unplatonic term, eudaimonia, with assimilation to God as far as possible. In another section of the same book, he implies that the Theaetetus passage reflects Plato's awareness of man as the eikon, as the image and likeness of God, as in Genesis. Man is endowed at birth with the image of God, but only achieves likeness to God through virtue, says Clement. This view, which was to become standard in Eastern Orthodoxy or in Eastern Christianity, agrees with Plato's position that homeosis theo presupposes a life of justice, holiness, and wisdom. In Book 7, Clement will add further preconditions for homeosis: impassibility, apatheia, mildness, philanthropia, besides Plato's holiness and righteousness. All this in Book 7. He has taken a well-known Platonic notion and amplified its meaning by connecting it to a life lived in imitation of Christ. Plato's life of virtue is superseded by imitatio Christi, which St. Paul summed up, for instance, in Galatians 2, "It is no longer I who live, but it is Christ who lives in me." Well then, to conclude, Christians, like Clement, held that they had received the truth of revelation via Scripture. This, we would say, anachronistically, was the defining soteriological act of reception. According to our author, the true philosophy of the New Testament had fulfilled and superseded the wisdom of the Greeks. In expounding this philosophy in the Stromates, Clement did two things. First, he availed himself of the format of a miscellany which was hospitable to canvassing ideas from different sources, and second, he drew inspiration and legitimation for this undertaking from the precedent of St. Paul's protreptic in Acts 17. In this speech, as you recall, Paul treated pagan ideas and literary references sympathetically and comparatively. A trained philosopher, Clement was of two minds about pagan philosophy. On the one side, he almost obsessively repeated Philo's and the apologist's anachronistic cliché that the Greek philosophers had plagiarized the Old Testament, sometimes willfully. On the other, he welcomed secular philosophy as a work of divine providence, as he puts it, and a handmaiden to Christian philosophy. He acknowledged that certain philosophers had figuratively tapped into the streams and tributaries of the mighty river Logos. The fact that Greek philosophers had been skilled plagiarists or had panhuman access to the Logos justified a Christian thinker's resort to pagan wisdom. This also explained, to Clement's mind, why Greek intellectuals often displayed degrees of convergence with Christian thinking and culture. From our point of view, Clement was domesticating a foreign philosophy, reclaiming it as Christian from the start, or so would a literary critic nowadays say. Although, as Clement would hasten to warn, the pagans' apprehension of the truth invariably remained partial, fragmentary, often obscure, their philosophy was a useful propaideia. It cultivated abstract thinking and purified the soul, and Plato would have agreed, and furnished Christian thinkers with the technical terminology and conceptual tools to interpret the scriptures, as Clement demonstrates. Thus he presses into service a snippet from the Timaeus to defend the creation account in Genesis and his negative theology. He takes the textbook commonplace of homoiosis theo and reworks it into the notion of imitatio Christi. He relies on Aristotle's logic to argue for the existence of God. We note that many pagan terms in Clement and the early fathers retain the same meaning. For instance, aion, anange, apatheia, arete, arche, theologia, ousia, homoousios, made of the same stuff. I'm just doing A's for the moment, or alphas. Yet other terms are more obviously invested with new meanings or nuances. Logos, spermatikos logos, which is stripped of its materiality. Sophia, even philosophia. His true philosophy is, in the words of one expert, Professor Stead, and I quote, a synthesis of the Bible freely interpreted with an eclectic philosophy based mainly on Plato. A Christian would ideally have to engage in such synthesis if, as Clement urged, he or she was to advance beyond unreflecting aphilosophetos, faith, which he called psili, bare. Christianity, starting with Origen and the Cappadocian Fathers, owes much to Clement's rapprochement with Hellenic philosophy. From the bits and bobs of this philosophy, he created a kind of middle testament between the old and the new one. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petropoulos.
Thank you.
I'm
Thank you for reading at short notice.
Yes. I'm sad to report that many of the questions I initially wrote down you then answered very well. So
Oh my goodness.
came up with some others here. So something that you and some of the other speakers noted is that Clement quotes very, very widely from a huge variety of different sources. And you note specifically that about half of his quotations come from Plato. I guess my first question is, for one, how unique was Clement in his kind of eclectic source material? Was it common for other thinkers at his time to quote either from the same sources as him or so voluminously? And then the kind of follow-up to that is, aside from Plato, who are his main other sources? Is it still these thinkers in the Platonic tradition? Is it these Stoic thinkers? Who's up there with Plato, if anyone? If you can comment on that.
Well, first of all, he has at his fingertips compendia, sort of, you might call them encyclopedias. This is the age. Their Google was the encyclopedia, the compendium. Needless to say, he was in Alexandria, so he may have had access to the library, the fantastic library, the fabulous library there, or one of its branches. It seems to have still been in existence. So it would have been easy for a pagan or Christian to draw on a diversity of sources, poetic, literary and philosophical. Now, what he's doing is mainstream Platonic or middle Platonism. That's what he's doing. It is the rage, it's the vogue from, I would say, from Philo or a little before Philo, so more or less the time of Jesus. They start, philosophers are, the schools have become decentralized. They're no longer in Athens, for instance. And so there are a lot of local libraries and local masters, local philosophers. They have these handbooks, and there's a lot of inter-fertilization, cross-fertilization of thought. So he's doing something very, very typical. So he's a middle Platonist, and it's a term used nowadays. It doesn't mean that it's middle brow or middling, but it's the Platonism which is syncretic, we'll call it syncretic, that followed there's Plato's academy per se, and then there's the skeptics who are just know-nothing party, the know-nothing party. And then come these very, I would say, dogmatic middle philosophers, middle Platonists, who are basically they take bits and bobs. So they'll take Plato's metaphysics, they'll take Stoic ethics and Aristotelian logic and mix them. But I think that Plato in the end holds sway, at least in Alexandria at this point. But his teacher Panthenos was said to have been a Stoic, right, a card-carrying Stoic. So it's very hard to say where's he coming from? It sounds a bit Platonic, but it might be a Stoic influence which has become Platonic. And as I said, he has Google at his fingertips, and he can do that. And a well-stocked mind, because he was erudite and well-educated, it seems. Yeah.
Great. So another question I have is regarding what you think, or if this is clear in the text, is Clement's intention in using such a voluminous set of non-Christian sources. Part of what you said about his comments on, you can eventually cast away the philosophy and just read scripture, so he doesn't seem to hold it as a kind of really high or divine source. Part of what came to mind for me and what I'm wondering is, did it almost seem like this is a cultural project or something like that? Like this philosophy, these texts, this is what people are reading, and this is a way of getting them through the door to Christianity, rather than the study of this philosophy for its own sake, rather using it kind of as a tool. Like, if you're interested in Plato, check this out too, and then eventually you don't need Plato anymore.
Right. Well, you hit the nail on the head. It is a tool. It's purely instrumental, or officially that's what he says. This is a mere prelude. It's it's a propaideia. It's preliminary education. But having said that, he's kind of doing two things. He's placating the anti-intellectual Christians by saying, look, after all, Plato is just Moses in disguise, so I'm not doing anything suspect. And then he's telling the pagans, look, our Bible or our scriptures are very venerable, highly venerable. They're more ancient than yours because, you have drawn upon us. He's struggling like the early church fathers, starting with the apologists, I would say, for three things. I call them the three C's. I'm writing a book on this. He's struggling to establish his canon, first of all, not only his Christian canon, but he's saying, can we use philosophy? He becomes a meta-philosopher. Can we use philosophy? And yes, we can use Plato for various reasons. Plato was a robber, a thief. Or, he expresses the Logos. And then the other C would be credentials. What are my credentials as a Christian in pagan society? I have credentials because I use Plato, you see. And thirdly, he's struggling. He's making a pitch for curriculum. That's the other C. What is our curriculum, or what should it be? Well, it should be based on Plato and the philosophers and Homer, but we must be eclectic. That's his overarching idea. We have to nowadays. You say eclectic has has bad undertones, but for him it was really a legitimate and legitimizing way of dealing with this diverse material. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yeah.
But basically, the game they're playing is called archaeologia. So he's trying to show that Christianity is venerable. It's not an upstart religion or philosophy. That's what Celsus said, and he was aware of what Celsus said. Mm-hmm. They were contemporaries. So he said, we're not upstarts and we're not plagiarists. You're the plagiarists, you see.
Okay, I have two more here. Mm-hmm. So I was really struck by what in your handout is text 12. I'll read it because it's short. It's there's only one way of truth, but different paths from different places join it, just like tributaries flowing into a perennial river. I think some of our students who have encountered perennialist philosophy and the similarities with I think of it as anti-materialistic strains of Gnosticism and Manichaeism in the ancient world. This quotation struck me as, although it's not directly stating anything in line with those traditions, as being compatible with them on the surface. I know that around, I'm a little hazy on the chronology, but I know that around Clement's time and in the ancient world in general, there was this strong strain of Manichaean-ish, anti-materialistic theologizing, and I'm curious if that's something Clement discusses or touches on. It could be, I'm getting the chronologies mixed up again, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I'm curious if he talks specifically about the incarnation, about the transfiguration of matter, right? These concepts that seem to come up in maybe later theology, or even just the incarnation in more direct and specific ways.
Well, he deals extensively with logos, the logos, and his book, or this massive work, is really an answer to the Gnostic cult, or whatever it was, the heresy. Mm-hmm. So he wants the real Gnostic who will go through an intellectual process and gradually Stromates proceeds from ethics through various grades to apocalypsis, you see, to revelation. So it is his answer to the Gnostics who believe that, only a gifted few, right, get this insight. But he says the insightful person will start by reading Plato and deepening his faith, not being aphilosophitos in his faith. That's what I can say regarding the Manichaeans and so forth. But this is one of the most interesting passages, I think, in the Stromates.
Yeah.
And it sounds a bit like Heraclitus, I think. Or it sounds... Clement is turning Heraclitus into Parmenides, into a monist, that there's one way, but there's one river, it's constantly changing, but it is one river, you see. And this is characteristically a Christian idea, of course, or monotheistic, because Porphyry and Themistius said the opposite. There are more than one ways. There are many ways. There's a multitude of ways to the gods. So,
thank you. So,
but aenon don't. Well, that means perennial or eternal. Yeah.
Okay, I have just one more here. Again, going back to Clement's eclectic kind of aesthetics or his openness to wide variety of sources, this seems to be, for the most part, in contrast to contemporary writers in the church who, at least my impression is, for the most part, don't rely on what we can think of as post-Christian or especially post-schism philosophical traditions. Notable example of this is a writer who was mentioned previously, Yanaras, who extensively seems to engage with the phenomenological tradition and so forth. But I'm curious just your opinion on kind of extrapolating Clement's approach to, in his day, pagan, in our day, secular texts. I mean, if he was engaging with these, with pre-Christian pagan poetry, what does that mean for a modern theological student to engage with Descartes or Leibniz or Heidegger or Nietzsche, for that matter? I know that's a speculative question, but I'm trying to kind of extrapolate from Clement's time to ours. Yeah.
But bear in mind that, to quote Father Patpapios, that he's at a time living in an era of theology in the making or in progress. So there isn't really a corpus. I think His Grace also mentioned there's not a corpus behind him. So he, of necessity and for cultural reasons, he had to rely on pagan tradition, this entirely alien tradition. Nowadays we have a lot of church fathers behind us and amongst us, so we can always we don't have to jump at the first secular theorist, and au contraire, I would say they should draw upon us. So that's what I would say. But then I would say, in the words, or just paraphrasing St. Paul, take the choicest bits of everything, secular and so forth, and use it to the greater glory of God. And it's the spoils of Egypt notion. Yeah. So that's what I would say. So, why look at, post, I shouldn't say, post this or that, when you have Palamas, Maximus, Homologites, and so on and so forth, go back to the sources, ad fontem or ad fontes, and then, play around with these other people who really are beholden, in a way, they may not even realize it, to patristic thinking. That's what I would say. But I'm not no one will take academics seriously nowadays. So,
Right. Thank you.
My talk is on apatheia, passionlessness in Clement and some of the Stoics. The struggle against the passions occupies one entire half of St. John's Ladder of Divine Ascent. It features prominently in the works of such Philokalia fathers as Evagrios of Pontus and other holy ascetics. Among the Desert Fathers, Abba Pimen, for example, was teaching that we have not been taught to kill the body, but to kill the passions. The struggle, expressed in terms one form or another, is arguably integral both to the words of Christ and the teaching of the great Apostle Paul. So much is clear. But the deeper theological and anthropological question is, do we mortify or even eradicate the passions, or are they a part of human nature that is somehow transformed, transfigured? Given the putative goodness of creation, a commonplace of Christian thought, does this concept come to bear upon our question? Now, it is well known that the Fathers made certain borrowings from pagan Greek philosophy, as we've seen in this symposium to some extent, often redefining terms from that philosophy, sometimes subtly, sometimes more overtly. Indeed, they were eclectic in their choices of which philosophies from which to borrow. One such choice was the term apatheia, passionlessness or dispassion, however one prefers to translate that. The Stoics are generally regarded as having viewed passions as a disordered impulse of the soul, ormi pleonazousa, to use Zenon's definition. That is to say, all the passions are irrational movements against nature. Some Stoics, such as Chrysippus, wondered how irrational affects could have occurred in the rational faculty, or ηγεμονικόν of the soul. Chrysippus defined passion as an excessive impulse and a false judgment of things. Be that as it may, the Stoics seem to have been in general agreement that the passions should be extirpated. This is even true of the Latin writer, the Latin Stoic, Seneca, who writes, "The question has often been raised whether it is better to have moderate emotions or none at all. Philosophers of our school reject the emotions. The peripatetics keep them in check." Another Stoic, Diogenes Laertius, had a slightly different approach. They say that the wise man is passionless because he is not prone to fall into such infirmity. But they add that in another sense, the term apatheia is applied to the bad man when, that is, it means that he is callous and reckless. So there could be another meaning of this term among the Stoics. As an aside, I might mention that Philo is an interesting case. In his commentary on the life of Abraham and Sarah, he is somewhat critical of the concept of apatheia. He prefers the term metriopatheia, moderation of the passions. Although elsewhere in his writings, he does cite apatheia as the higher ideal for which to strive. As the Stoic scholar John Rist has written, in general, all passions are diseases, and the victims may be viewed as mentally deranged. Interesting observation. They are pathological disturbances of the personality. All such diseases or diseased impulses should be extirpated and replaced by others that are totally subordinate to reason. All emotions are to be rationally controlled. And Zenon even added that when a when a man has achieved apatheia, the scars of his entire earlier irrational impulses remain in his soul. So we have here the suggestion that apatheia does not totally transform the soul and its drives and desires in Stoic thought. Clement is the first great Christian writer to take up the idea of apatheia at length. St. Justin Martyr mentions it once or twice, but Clement is the first Christian writer to use the term repeatedly in an anthropological context. He repeats Zenon's definition of pathos as an excessive impulse, quote-unquote, disobedient to reason, or quote-unquote, contrary to nature. Further, passions are diseases of the soul, of which we should try to rid ourselves. Prima facie, as the lawyers pronounce that term, this indeed sounds Stoic, and some scholars simply view Clement as repeating the Stoic concept, pure and simple. But superficial looks can be deceiving. One needs to see Clement's idea in context to determine whether that context is orthodox or not. In Stromatis, Book 7, for example, Clement will portray St. Paul as essentially teaching apatheia, even though the apostle does not use the precise terminology. One other major difference comes immediately to mind. While Stoics envision the soul as unitary, Clement follows the Platonists in viewing the soul as tripartite. The nous is a faculty of the rational part, or logistikon. The lower faculties are thymos and epithymia, a desirous faculty and an irascible faculty. And these lower faculties constitute, in fact, irrational faculties until they are purified at any rate. This immediately suggests that apatheia was more fundamental, in a sense, to the Stoics, given their unitary view of the soul that strictly did not allow for irrational faculties. Though, as we shall see, the means for attaining dispassion or apatheia were much more rigorous in Clement's Christian conception. So this is what I propose to do, to look at apatheia in Clement in context. We shall see that the term acquired various nuances in meaning when Clement associates it with scriptural concepts. Excuse me. Again, in the background of all this, we need to bear in mind the distinction. This distinction. Is this the eradication of the passions of which we are speaking, or their transformation and transfiguration? The first thing we notice is that Clement links apatheia to the image of God in man. The Logos is actually the true image of God. He is also the archetype for the true man, the nous, which is thus the image of the image. The Christian Gnostic, or holy man, if you will, for Clement, thus represents the third stage of the image, made as far as possible in the likeness of the Logos. Clement writes, "For the image of God is the divine and royal word, the impassible man, apathis, and the image of the image is the human nous. So inasmuch as the nous has for its archetype the impassible man, that is Christ, this demands that man acquire apatheia, a divine property, for the Gnostic to be fully in the image and likeness of God." As an aside, it should be stated that the Stoics, some Stoics, linked apatheia to assimilation or kinship with God. A not unrelated idea, but the image and likeness language of Clement is decidedly scriptural. Clement establishes a second link, that between apatheia and synergy. Clement writes, "For a man training and working for apatheia achieves nothing, but if he plainly shows himself very desirous and earnest about this, he attains it by the addition of the power of God. For God conspires with willing souls, but if they abandon their eagerness, the spirit which is bestowed by God is also restrained. Man thus cannot attain the heights of apatheia without the aid of divine grace, this power of God. In this cooperation with divine power, man is able to achieve apatheia. As an aside, we may note, as Werner Jaeger has observed, Clement is the first Christian writer to develop a fairly sophisticated theology of synergy. And in that context, he uses different terms to express the free will of man. For example, the Stoic auftexousia, self-determination, Aristotelian proeresis, slightly redefined, if you will, by him, I think, to express free will. But this concept of synergy in the Blessed Clement is another topic for another lecture entirely. Clement's pedagogos has been characterized by a spiritual ideal of moderation, or metriopathia. It is rather the stromatis that is dominated by the ascetic ideal of apatheia. In this higher stage of the spiritual life, the cessation of all desire is the means of achieving the goal of Gnostic perfection. But apatheia in turn is also achieved through gnosis and ascesis. Thus, Clement writes, "We must therefore raise the Gnostic and perfect man from all passion of soul, for gnosis produces training, synaskin, and training habit or disposition, and such a state as this produces apatheia, not moderation. For complete eradication of desire, Pantelis tis epithemia secopi reaps as its fruit apatheia, complete eradication of desire. Ekopi is a cutting off or eradication. I believe it also can be translated as an amputation. That's the imagery Clement uses. At times, gnosis is viewed as producing ascesis, asceticism. At other times, gnosis represents the perfection of asceticism. I would suggest that these concepts, along with apatheia, are interrelated in Clement's thinking. He interprets St. Paul's words from 1 Corinthians chapter 6, "Ye washed yourselves," as referring to the subjection of the passions to the Logos. Through gnosis, which I suppose we could translate in Clement as experiential, spiritual knowledge. Further, St. Paul's next verse, "Ye were made holy," he interprets in a similar way. For holiness belongs to the one who has attained such a state, a stable state, exis, that he never in any way slips into any passion, but is, as it were, already freed from the flesh, asarko, dative case, having reached a holiness that transcends the world. The word asarkos, fleshlessness, points to another way in which Clement's teaching differs from that of the Stoics. One scholar argues that Clement's understanding of apatheia is actually more rigorous than that of the Stoics, in that he rejects the Stoic idea that there are rational passions, eupathia. Clement maintains that even desire itself must be eliminated. It can be seen that passion is more intense for Clement because it is interpreted in the context of biblical ideas about sin, flesh, and the crucifixion of the self. The biblical flesh signifies a much more troubling reality for Clement than for the Stoics, and he follows St. Paul in depicting this struggle against flesh, quote unquote, as a matter of life and death. Though once again, gnosis and ascesis required must be joined with or influenced by the divine power. Clement writes, "Such a one, the Gnostic, has an accurate understanding of unless ye hate your father and mother, yea, and even your life itself, and unless ye bear the sign," St. Luke's Gospel, "for he hates the inclination toward the passions of the flesh, with their potent magic of pleasure, and he looks down on all that is likely to produce and nourish the flesh. But he resists the corporeal soul, tis somatikis, by putting a bit in the mouth of the irrational spirit, to alogo pneumati, when it breaks loose, because what the flesh desires is opposed to the spirit," as St. Paul writes in Galatians. Clement is also a little ambivalent when he speaks regarding which specific passions are necessary for the maintenance of the physical body, anticipating here the concept of blameless as opposed to blameworthy passions, and which are to be totally mastered. In Book 6 of the Stromatis, he initially allows that some passions are necessary. A little later, however, he gives the example of the holy apostles, quote, "who gnostically mastered even those passible movements which seem to be good, such as joy, courage, and zeal. Moreover, the Gnostic will no longer need such virtues as temperance, sophrosini, as, and this is important, he will no longer need to control desire." As we have seen, Clement views passion as an excessive appetite exceeding the measures of logos. When he uses logos here as well, it's difficult to know if he's referring to obedience to the logos in man's soul, the higher part of the soul, or obedience to the divine logos, the second person of the Trinity. Seems it can be read in either way, given the context. Thus, and this is another key point, asceticism aims not so much at removing, extirpating the natural movements of the person, as subjecting them to a strict obedience to the Logos. The Gnostic Christian therefore no longer has to struggle against the passions, having attained apatheia. And again, just as God is apathis, so must the Gnostic be, if he is to be in the likeness of God and fully assimilated to God. The Gnostic becomes fleshless asarkos or fleshless, and lives above the world. Lives above the world. Sometimes Clement almost sounds like a desert father, the way he's writing about apatheia. It seems to me that the passions have not been eradicated for Clement as in early Stoic thought. Nor have they been totally transformed into virtues as in later patristic thought, but they have been subjected in obedience to the Logos. And this represents somewhat of a Christianization of the concept. Clement brings together a number of these themes in the following passage from Book 7 of the Stromatis. This is the activity of the perfected Gnostic, to have converse with God through the great high priest, being made like the Lord as far as may be, by means of the whole service, therapia, toward God, a service which tends to the salvation of men through care of the goodness toward us, and on the other side, through liturgy, through goodness, through teaching, and through beneficence and deeds. Being assimilated to God, the Gnostic even creates and forms himself. Eavthon κτίζει και δημιουργεί. He creates and forms himself, and adorns those who hear him, assimilating as far as possible by an ascesis which tends to apatheia, to him who is by nature impassible. And this is uninterrupted converse and communion with the Lord. And we come to another hint in Clement, more than a hint really, of continuous prayer. He speaks of ησυχία in the Stromatis. He speaks of continuous prayer. He speaks of continuous remembrance of God. He writes, "The soul which is ever improving in the acquisition of virtue and the increase of righteousness should obtain a better place in the universe, as tending in each step of advancement toward the habit of impassibility, is exin apatheos, the habit of impassibility." There's another interesting phrase there. As tending toward the habit of impassibility till it come to a perfect man, up to the transcendent and continual contemplation of the Lord in eternity. Again, a whole lecture on Clement's understanding of the prayer life would pay dividends, I believe, to any scholar. So in conclusion, we do not find in Clement the later patristic concept of the passion of holy love, as in St. Maximus the Confessor, nor do we find the concept of the aim of the Christian life expressed in a transposition or redirection, a metathesis of the passions, rather than their mortification or necrosis, as we find in St. Gregory Palamas, who speaks of the transfiguration of the passions. But this concept, the transfiguration of the passions, was only developed after centuries of ascetic experience among the fathers of the desert. Earlier fathers, Evagrius, for example, often expressed the state of apatheia in rather Stoic terms, although at times he too partially Christianizes apatheia in, for example, linking it with love, agape. But we do find the first attempt at Christianization in Clement. We find an articulation halfway, as it were, to the later patristic usage. And we see in Clement, therefore, yet another example of his trailblazing articulation of theology and the spiritual life. Again, he links apatheia with the doctrine of image and likeness of God. He links to the concept of synergy. And he links it with gnosis and asceticism. In short, Clement brings philosophy to bear on scriptural exegesis and theology, not the reverse. Thus, he is Christianizing the concept and is the first Christian writer to widely employ the concept of apatheia. Thank you for your kind attention.
I have some questions that are kind of interconnected, and so I figured I should probably try to ask them all at the same time because I'm not sure in what order to ask. So we heard about the Stoics' ideas about what the passions are, and there was a lot of overlap, it seemed, with what Clement understood them to be.
Terminology, yes.
In terminology, at least.
Yes.
But I was a little bit confused because I wanted to know if in Clement's writings, does the term for passions, or does passions refer simply to the disordered state, the excessive or irrational activity of impulses, of natural impulses? Or is the term passions being used for those impulses themselves, regardless of their orientation? And the reason I'm asking this, because you did address it somewhat, is because at first my impression was that that perhaps the seeming opposite extremes of the eradication of the passions versus the transformation of the passions, it seemed to me like it could be just a difference of perspective on talking about the same process. Because if you're talking about passions as the excess or disorder of impulses, then the eradication of this disorder or excess would be, the imposition of order, or or if you're going to talk about it as disease, it would be the healing. So you could sort of talk about it either way. That was my impression at first, but then I was a little confused because in one place, whether it was on the way to apathia or a description of apathia, I wasn't sure, that you mentioned this as the cessation of all desire.
Mm-hmm.
And especially from, like, when I read what St. Macrina said on the Soul and Resurrection, about when she's speaking, I guess this would have been a couple of hundred years later, about sort of the faculties of the soul and their having a purpose, which is, like, there's a right purpose for them, and then the passions are the wrong, or the disfiguration of them. So, sorry, this is a little confused, but I was trying to figure out how Clement is speaking about the passions as opposed to the impulses themselves, because I was wondering how you could strive towards God without desire at all.
I don't follow exactly your distinction between the passions versus the impulses themselves.
So you have the impulses, and then you have they're either disordered.
Actually doing the.
Yes, so either them being disordered or excessive or diseased. So that excess, disorder, or disease is a separate thing from the impulses,
No,
right?
it's going to lead directly to the impulses.
Okay, so are those impulses themselves what he's calling passions, or is he just calling, like, the
Well, this gets to. I'd have to look more closely at his precise use of terminology, to be honest. I'm not. He uses the word ekopie, as I quoted, which is actually the cutting off of the passions, which sounds very Stoic. Sounds like the eradication of the passions. My point was that in the context of the other things, the other things in which he places his doctrine of the passions, synergy, image and likeness, asceticism and gnosis, that's the way he's Christianizing the term, even though he sounds Stoic in many ways. But admittedly, he doesn't get to the later patristic idea, like St. Gregory Telpeneff, where the passions really are transformed and transfigured. The point is, passions have to be ontologically transformed and transfigured in apathia and later patristic thought. He's not quite there yet, but he's almost halfway there, shall we say. He clearly sees the need. He likes the Stoic term. It serves his purposes for talking about struggling against the passions, which is clearly a Christian idea. And he finds it helpful to articulate the doctrine of struggle against the passions. And he tries to Christianize it, as I said, in several ways. That's Clement in a nutshell, I think.
Thank you. I also was wondering, when you mentioned about logos, I was about to ask you about whether he was talking about the human logos or
Yeah,
the
we
divine.
don't. The
and-
Greek texts aren't capitalized there
So-
necessarily.
but I wondered whether
so,
that was an intentional lack of clarity.
double entendre
Well, I mean, like to indicate synergy. Do you think? Maybe.
could be. Depends on. You have to look at each verse in context. Could be.
And so my final question is, in some of these other talks we've heard, ways in which the writings of Clement have particular relevance to issues of our own day. And I was wondering if there were any particular elements of Clement's writings about apatheia that you think might be of particular relevance to
Well,
modern Christian context.
Yes, I think so. I think you could put passages from Clement in the Philokalia, a similar book. In fact, we have a project in mind. Father Patpapios and Dr. Petropoulos and I, we have a project in mind to come up with the Philokalia of Clement, similar to the Philokalia of Origen that the Cappadocians put together. Not that we're going to reach their heights of discernment and perspicacity, but in a small way, it would be helpful for students reading Clement to be able to focus on these specific passages that really are crucial to the spiritual life. Because Clement is as much a spiritual writer as he is a theological writer. That much, I think, is clear once you read his, especially the Stromatis.
Well, thank you very much, Father.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.